This will be part 1 of many for Dossoles holiday content. With modules being added in the upcoming update, this video is intended to cover all the CN modules released up till Break the Ice and give a general overview of their usability, or in other terms, a tier list. If you already know what modules are, skip to the timestamp on screen now to skip the introduction. Modules are sort of a Trust 300 for operators in the sense that they provide additional stats alongside what's usually above to one's trait. They are substantially cheaper than Elite 2 promotion costs, requiring module kits, LMD, and some materials to unlock, coupled with a specific side quest depending on character. For example, Chanka's module requires him to deal 150,000 damage. Modules are generally sorted and released by archetype, with usually 2 different module types per archetype. They are not intended as a balancing mechanic, as due to the limited data we have, it seems like the power level increases similarly with the initial power level of the operator, making broken units more broken and so on. So far, we have modules for a very small portion of operators in the game, but they are releasing at a rate of multiple archetypes per update, so it's likely all operators will get them very soon. So here's the module tier list up on screen right now, and I'll go over the different explanations. In S tier we have Phantom and Bagpipe, A tier Passenger, Palace and Deep Color, B tier having Fartooth, Pudding, Waifu, Granny, Wildmane, Cutter, Bybig, Firewatch, Perfumer and Nightingale. C tier Lazy, Chen, Project Red, Gravel, Ondriana, Embryo, Telopsis, Kafka, Vigna. D tier Chanka, Reed, Breeze, Whislash, Swire, Doberman. And at U we have Mayor, Scene and Magellan. Firstly, a brief explanation of their ratings. S indicates modules which significantly impact an operator's use case. A for modules which solidly buff an operator's DPS or utility. B for less impactful stat buffs, and so on. The tier list attempts to combine an evaluation of how much the module upgrades the operator, along with the operator's initial usefulness. So someone going from shit to slightly less shit is going to be ranked much lower than a unit going from decent to good, or slight improvements to an already very strong unit. The 2 modules in S are mainly due to CC risks and how, due to the flagpipe meta, every contingency contract event is forced to have DP down demerits. Bagpipe's module gives her full refund based on her current cost, fixing her trait in a way. Currently, her trait only refunds the initial cost, so let's say Bagpipe costs 11 initially, and after you redeploy her a couple of times and she costs 22 DP, once you retreat her, you only get 11 refund. However, this makes it so that once you retreat her at 22 DP, you now get 22 DP back, which you can see why this is pretty strong. This is on top of the +1 DP per kill and the extra stats, which makes it pretty comical, and hey, more reason to max bot her. It's great for high risk CC, but you probably wouldn't notice it a ton in general use due to the lack of DP issues owing to flag bearer abuse and all. Phantom is a similar case, but this is a unit you'll probably deploy more than a couple of times per map, and the DP refund going from 50% to 80% is very significant given that at potential 1 and max redeploy DP increase is an additional 6 DP refunded. It will likely be noticeable in general content, and the argument that Phantom isn't meta in CC isn't particularly valid given how he showed up in high risk CC6 and CC7 with skill 3. We have a lot of contenders in A and they all get solid boosts from their modules, with the exception of Deep Color, which I'll get to later. Passenger's module, which gives him slightly more slow duration and less damage fall off per bounce, is often overstated as the thing that brings him into prominence and elevates him from a moody blue tier unit to one that certain CM players might compare to Angelina, but that's not particularly true. He was vastly underestimated before module, and the module just acts to put him in the spotlight and thus allowed more people to actually try him out instead of dismissing him as a meme, leading to his current status as a somewhat decent 6-star unit, at least in the context of his skill 2 as a slower. In my opinion, it's still a very great general use buff, but not the huge boost that a lot of people like to make it out to be. Palace's module doesn't look that fantastic on paper, with an additive 10% attack skill, but again, it's a solid DPS increase for a unit that is mostly dependent on stat checks. Nothing much more to say, as I've covered Palace's strengths and general weaknesses including her module in my latest, controversial video so to speak. Lastly, we have Deep Color. The other summoner modules I've placed at Ungraded because it takes a lot of game understanding to utilize them properly, and frankly I am not a summoner expert, so I won't have a strong stance on the matter. But this module is fairly easy to understand. Having 7 tentacles simultaneously at a cheaper cost is just nuts for even general purpose deployment, and it can enable even newbies to utilize her kit at a reasonable efficiency. Now's probably a good time to mention summoner modules aside from DC. It's probably best to put them in the range of A to B, but I don't feel comfortable giving advice on units that I don't very commonly use. It certainly has potential to change strategies involving, say, triple summoners, but when was the last time you actually saw a Mayor Mag scene Drill clear as opposed to just, say, Thorn's Abuse? The module wouldn't have a giant impact on double summoner clears, as deployment slot is generally not an issue in that regard. Moving on to lower tiers, I wouldn't be going over each module specifically, but generally speaking none of them are too special. Fartooth's damage increase scaling with range is great in the situations that you're actually going to use her, but again those situations are pretty rare in which her optimal use case is provided. Pudding is in the same position as Passenger, so a general boost is always nice, especially for a 4-star. Y has the same module as Phantom, but she's generally a much less all-round useful unit. However, 80% DP refund is still 80% DP refund, and it would be a crime to have her any lower. Granny and Wild Main have the same insane module that Bagpipe does, but frankly they will never see use in CC, and outside of that the full DP refund as opposed to 50% for a 1-block Vanguard is less useful. Although combined with +1 DP on kill, they still land a solid spot in B. Cutter and Bybig modules, although different on paper, still boost the overall DPS by a decent margin considering you're using Bybig's skill 1. Most people use her skill 2 though, so the DPS increase is less substantial given how it's more of a stalling skill. Cutter's 70 defense ignore is great though, seeing as her skill 1 is multi-hit alongside her auto attacks, making an already broken 4-star more so. Perfumer's module on paper is something that probably should be in A tier, but the circumstances at which you're actually going to E2 her and make full use of her kit are rare given how popular Tolopsis is as a unit alongside Nightingale's raw strength. It's something more like an late game investment, and at that point you'll probably have Tolopsis to E2 instead of Perfumer for her module. Nightingale's +1 range can allow for more unique placements, especially in tower restricted content like Contingency Contract, and although it doesn't carry over to her skill 3, it's still very good to have. Firewatch is kind of in the chasm between B and C, but I've bumped her up here since the module has potential. Getting the nuke skill more often is great, but oftentimes the cycle isn't the issue. It's still probably better than the standard damage for faraway enemies that other wide range snipers have, though. Stuff in C are generally units that don't have inherently good power levels or don't receive a substantial enough boost from their module to be worth mentioning in higher tiers. Starting with most controversial because I love that stuff, we have Chen. 10% damage skill for her skill 3 is great, don't get me wrong, but the main issue of the skill is not the damage but the cycle. In the situations where it matters, the damage generally isn't an issue, and the breakpoints for say one-shotting bosses are often accomplished with a Warfront, with the 10% being more quality of life than anything. Tolopsis is in the same situation as Nightingale wherein it allows her to be more flexible in positioning, but seeing as she's a more general content unit and her skill 2 already also has a range extension that does not factor in module, it's reasonable to place her lower due to the lack of CC viability in that regard. Embryo, Andriana, Kafka and Red's modules can be grouped together as just minor damage boosts that don't do anything too special, so while they're nice if you have them as a wife or use them a ton, it's not something that you'll particularly focus on. Vigna gets the worst DP on kill module, but it's an okay DPS increase I guess. Lazy's in the same spot as Pudding or Passenger, but she's just substantially worse than both of them. D and below are the modules you generally don't care about with the exception of maybe the first. Chanka's 10% damage skill is decent if you're playing hyper buff, and not a ton of people do that. In a standalone context, it is strictly worse than 10% attack skill due to its post-mitigation nature, but it's still a module that is worth considering if you like playing hyper buff Chanka. Reed has the same module as Vigna, but gameplay wise she's just worse, so I don't see a ton of reason to go for it unless again it's a waifu reason. Breeze, well, Perfumer exists and her module is substantially better. Wishslash and Swire are pure support oriented units, so the extra damage skill is pretty worthless, and at lowest tier we have Doberman, who is self-explanatory.